I can't think of a better way of explaining the crisis the Chinese Super League is in right now than their champions, their defending champions, have folded. Jiangsu Suning.
Hi guys, good to see you all again for what should be another fascinating, if fairly different episode, because we're going to look at the Chinese Super League. You would have heard so much about the rise in recent years, but relatively little about the demise. It's something that Matt Slater and Ollie Kay have written about on The Athletic. You can go and check it out now. The latest offer we're running at the moment will appear on the screen just now, so feel free to sign up. It would be a pleasure to have you all. And I'm delighted to be joined by Matt Slater to get stuck into a really important issue. And we're going to begin by retracing the rise initially, because it came about after the Chinese Super League, the authorities over there, had sort of cleaned up football after a lot of allegations of corruption. You saw people like David Beckham becoming global ambassadors, the likes of Didier Drogba signing for a Chinese club, and then it really started to accelerate into about 2016 when some star names from world football were signed. So I'm going to ask Matt to firstly just sum up what the boom of the Chinese Super League looked like.
Yes, well, I'm going to take you back to January 2016. Like a Chinese firecracker, it just went boom. So, as you say, Chinese Super League was sort of turning itself around. Bigger names were being attracted there, but we still didn't know what was about to happen. So, we get to January 2016. The Chinese transfer record broken 3 times in about 10 days. I think it was Ramirez, then Jackson Martinez, Alex Teixeira. Big salaries. They were competing for a lot of South American talent, but they were competing with European clubs and winning. Once those 3 came, it really opened the floodgates. I mean, Oscar was a big one with Chelsea. Carlos Tevez, of course, huge money. I think that his fee was pretty big, but his salary was massive. I mean, it was a reported £600,000 a week. There was talk of bids for, who names it? Ronaldo, Messi. It seemed like the world was their oyster. Diego Costa was, of course, perhaps the end of this sort of boom cycle. That was a deal that didn't quite come off. But in between that, there were all sorts: Carrasco and Paulinho, and a dozen players, but big name managers too. So for a time it looked like the Chinese Super League was going to really challenge the big 5 leagues in Europe. And I do remember one of the Deloitte reports around that time had an entire section, one of the Deloitte sort of financial annual reports they do on the state of global football, had an entire chapter on, Chinese Super League. Is the whole direction of sort of global football being tilted that direction? It did seem for a time as though that might be the case.
You may remember a quote from Arsene Wenger saying that the Premier League should be worried, and that taps into what you talk about there. But I want to know why this happened. We saw famously the Chinese president at Manchester City with David Cameron having a selfie with Sergio Aguero, and it wasn't really explained at the time exactly why they were doing this, but now we've sort of had time to process it, we know.
Yeah, President Xi Jinping, that's why it happened. Okay, so he came to power in, I think, 2014-15. I think it's 2014. His first national plan, the one that he did, they do these big national plans there. Very organised economy, obviously run by the Chinese Communist Party. And football was at the heart of it. He wanted to be a man of the people. He likes football. It chimed well with China's ambitions on the global stage. Of course, they'd staged the 2008 Olympics. That was supposed to be their coming out party as this sort of emerging global superpower. They would say going back to where they should have been, their rightful place, if you like. Football was going to be a big part of that. So not only did we have the big investments in the Chinese Super League, where he really encouraged major corporations, the big companies, to back clubs and go out and get this talent. He encouraged people to go buy football clubs abroad. One, to sort of extend Chinese soft power, but also to learn, also to become a player. They bought agencies like Wonder. They made a bid for Stella. They bought Atletico, Southampton, Wolves, the list there. I mean, they bought sort of dozens of European clubs. And that deal with City Football Group was really significant. They only bought sort of, at the time, I think it was about 15% stake, but it was with Chinese state money. There was the famous selfie with Aguero and David Cameron. It really seemed like peak Chinese football boom. So it was very much tied up with President Xi's ascent to power. He wanted to assert his control. He wanted to portray Chinese power, and football was going to be one of the vehicles.
And right at the top of that, he wanted China not only to qualify for a World Cup, but to host one and to win one as well. So it seemed stepping stones, quite spectacular stepping stones on the way towards an ultimate goal. But then it didn't quite go to plan.
No, too much too soon perhaps, or too quickly anyway. I mean, the whole Chinese football economy got overheated very, very quickly. The sums that they were throwing around were frankly unsustainable for the sort of size of their fan base, for the size of their football economy. I mean, he as you say, bidding, competing, winning World Cups was medium long-term plan as well. But he also had this vision of creating a domestic sports economy, to kind of rival the States, really. That football would be the driver of that. And frankly, the just roots weren't there. It was shallow. The football culture wasn't there. It's a big country. There are only 16 Chinese Super League teams, so there is sort of a kind of gap between fan and club. And of course, Chinese football fans support European football clubs, or in fact, increasingly European or football players. Really, they go from club to club. So he was trying to do too much too soon. In fact, not just him, because it sort of got a little bit out of control. That having sort of unleashed the powers of Chinese private wealth, some people were showing off. Some people were frankly laundering money. Some people just didn't really know what they were doing. So mistakes were made at home and abroad, and the whole thing, quite quickly, they started to put the brakes on back in China. They went from sort of 4 foreign players to 3. Salary cap talk started quite soon, and players weren't settling. So domestically, it started to sort of unravel pretty fast, and overseas it's taken a little bit longer. But most of those Chinese investments in European clubs have been disastrous. They really, frankly, have. The national team hasn't improved. This bid we've been expecting for 2030, I don't think that's going to materialise, because they're just not ready. They're not ready to compete. So it wasn't really working. Let's be honest, it wasn't working. It wasn't making China better at football. It wasn't really expanding China's soft power, because it wasn't quite working. So there's that. President Xi got distracted by more important things. China's place in the world, its increasing rivalry with the States, Taiwan, Hong Kong, you name it. Other priorities came along, so the timeline shifts. He still likes football. He still wants China to be successful, but it's just not as important as it was to him back in 2015, 2016.
So COVID came along, which obviously accelerated the downfall. And I'd like you to explain how big a role that played, or was it already sliding? And crucially, this is what I and many people will want to hear the most. What's going on now? Have all these players just left? Have the coaches left? Rafa Benitez obviously did from Dalian. Carrasco was another name who I remember being desperate to get out. What do the teams look like now? They don't even seem to be called the same thing. Stadiums are not being built. There seems to be a sense of crisis.
They halted the Chinese Super League this season. The main reason was, the public reason was to give the China national team a good chance to qualify for Qatar. So they kind of halted the season, and that hasn't worked. So they played 6 games, China. They've only beaten Vietnam. They lost their first 3 games. So that hasn't worked. They're not going to get to Qatar. So we're waiting for the resumption of the Chinese Super League. Now, compounding the issues, China obviously has taken a very sort of aggressive, understandably so, approach to COVID. It's been very, very strict lockdown. So you had overseas players trying to leave already. You've got not much coming and going now with China generally in terms of overseas foreign people, money, people. You mentioned the stadium. So the stadium, I think, is a really nice way of kind of encapsulating this story. So back in the boom moment, they were going to do everything. They were going to do everything at once. So they were going to build the biggest football stadium, this lotus flower design, Guangzhou, built by Evergrande, this massive property company, and this was going to stage one of their World Cup games. They've changed the plan. They've made it a bit more boring. Why? Because they are now interested in stadium diplomacy. They're now more interested in building stadiums for developing world countries than they are really in staging a World Cup. So they wanted a plan that they could sort of replicate around the world. They wanted something a bit more Chinese, something a little less showy. And that project's been taken on by the Chinese government. Evergrande are in real trouble. The names of the teams, they wanted to sort of make them sound more like football teams as opposed to offshoots of companies like Suning, companies that are in trouble, companies that have dropped their football team. So I can't think of a better way of explaining the crisis the Chinese Super League is in right now than their champions, their defending champions, have folded. Jiangsu Suning.
It's an absolutely captivating subject. Thank you for explaining it so thoroughly. And I think there's a piece in there for you on where are they now, the Chinese Super League boom turning into a bust. I suspect some people have done pretty well out of it, but I'm sure there are many stories to be told. So thank you very much for your time. And thank you everybody who watched that video for tuning in. We'll be back again soon.